Good evening, everybody. Just after 7:30, so high time we got going. Welcome to the last indoor meeting of the season. It's zipped past as far as I'm concerned. As usual, anybody on Zoom, if you get any problems with the sound, please do put a note into the chat function. Elaine is hosting tonight and will do her best to help. Is the lovely Egyptian picture.
We've got an echo.
Sorry?
We've got an echo, but that could be on well.
Oh yeah, Connor, could I just ask you to mute until we're ready to go? Thank you. Right, some brief introductions as usual. We have
Still got an echo.
I'm not sure what else I could say. Have a look through and see if anybody else is unmuted. We have a few. We have one new member I'd like to welcome. That's Catherine Dorgan, who I don't think is here tonight. She's on Zoom. Well, very welcome, Catherine. And we're delighted you've joined us, and I hope you have a long and happy association with the club. Nice to see you. I can't quite see you on your Zoom picture, but I can see you're there. Our next season, as I said, this is the last meeting for this season. The next season's programme is being worked on and will be published in August as usual. So, but the first meeting, indoor meeting, will be on Wednesday, October the 23rd. So you put that in your diaries. I was hoping now to be able to award a prize from the photo comp last week to David Floyd, but I don't think he's here, is he? No. Oh well. He did a lovely picture of Goldcrest, and we're expecting him tonight to be able to give him his voucher, but we can't win them all. Okay, some future information about future meetings. As I said, this is our last indoor meeting, but we've got a lot of outdoor meetings coming up. If you've been watching the slide, you'll know that there were 9 different outdoor meetings on there, 3 of which are in April. The first one of those is Saturday the 20th, which is an introduction to Berkshire birding with Peter Driver leading it, going to Decoy Heath. And then just over a week later, on the 28th, Sunday, there's an early morning birdsong walk at Dinton, led by Brian Bennett. And when he says early, it's only actually 7:30, which is not, I don't think it's that bad. Yeah, probably early. And then the next day, on Monday the 29th, there's a joint meeting with the NDOC, and that's a day trip to Rye Harbour, which Bob Lyle is leading as usual. And as I said, there's another 6 in the programme. Normally we've got some copies of the programme. I've probably got 1 or 2 spares if anybody wants one. But the best thing to do is to look on the website, because that's where the most up-to-date information is if you need any. And I was about to say we have 4 places left for the bird fair in July, but I've just had 2 booked, so we're down to 2 places now. So if anybody wants to come on the minibus trip on the 13th of July, that's a Saturday, to the bird fair, the global bird fair, please let me know as soon as possible. A few meetings for other organisations. NDOC's next outdoor meeting is on Saturday the 6th of April, where they're going to Speen Moors. And then after that, their next one is on the 28th of April, with Woolhampton Gravel Pit. Reading RSPB, their next indoor, they've got one left. That's on Tuesday the 9th of April. And this is one from Mike Coker. Actually, I think he's on our Zoom tonight. Hi. And that's what's the difference between a bittern and a curlew. And their next outdoor meeting is on Tuesday the 16th, when they're going to Bowdown Woods. I got that wrong last time. Yeah, is that right? Yeah. And the last group I'll just mention tonight, RSPB, Wokingham and Bracknell. Their next indoor meeting is on Thursday the 11th. So that's next week. And it's going to be a familiar face for those of you who are here tonight, because it's going to be Conor Jameson talking looking for the goshawk. So if you enjoyed his talk tonight, then you can see him again next week. And then next outdoor meeting is on Saturday the 13th, which is a day trip to Ditchfield Haven. So that's all the... Oh, I've got a hand waving at me from Elaine. What would you want?
On chorus for April the 14th, starting at 5:30 at the East Road into the Statesman.
I will try and repeat that then for the people on Zoom. Early environmental group have a dawn chorus, which I happen to know will be led by Elaine, I believe, at 5:30 on Sunday, the 14th of April. And where was it?
It starts at the Road Interpretation Centre, Maiden Early Reserve.
Maiden Early Reserve, Stowe Road Interpretation Centre. And we both did it last year. It was lots of birds to see, or hear, I should say, really. So I thoroughly recommend it, even if it is 5:30. Best time of day for birds. Right, recent sightings. You might have, those of you paying attention to the bird song earlier will have noticed that the nightingales came in. The first ones were heard on Monday down at Main Pit Seal. So it's nice to know they're back. And I'm seeing that there's quite a few willow warblers and blackcaps singing now already. And there's a few more exotic species about. There's a slightly disputed hoopoo. It's like, I'm looking at Rob because it's a bit unclear on Berk's birds whether it's where exactly it was, somewhere near the Jubilee River. But that was on April the 1st. So. And a merlin at somewhere I scribbled down, I can't read my handwriting now. Is it Lambourne? Oh, Lovel's Lake, sorry, wrong. White Stark at Shinfield, Grange and Burfield and Common, and 4 pink-footed geese at Lower Farm. What about the rest of you? What have other people been seen? They've all been within the last week or so. Go on, Sue.
I walked at Wishmore a couple of days ago, and there were quite a few woodlarks singing.
Excellent.
Beautifully, and what's the other thing I said? Red poles.
Oh, right, so that was Sue saying Wishmore, and that's woodlark singing.
And
stone chats.
Let me see if I can get this right. Woodlark singing.
Yes.
Red poles.
Yes.
Stone chat.
Yes.
I've forgotten the other one. Crossbills. The
No,
Dartford warbler.
No crossbills, because
Oh, they don't. Okay, one at a time. Red poles. Yeah, I did red poles and the Dartford warbler. Excellent.
Yeah.
What about everybody else? Anybody on Zoom been seeing anything exciting? There's a distinct lack of action on there. What about here? Well, it's lovely, as far as I'm concerned, it's lovely that the warblers are coming back and the nightingales back. So it's always my favourite time of birding, favourite time of the year for birding, if I can get out of bed early enough anyway. Right. Okay, unless there's any other business from anybody, we'll move on, and I'm going to set up the tech for the speaker before I introduce him. So if I could ask you, where are you, Conor, to share your screen and unmute yourself.
Right, how are we doing?
And I'm just trying to get you. That's right. We've just got you now on the screen with just you visible. That look okay on? Like I say, it looks okay on Zoom. That look okay, Elaine?
Yes.
Right. Just turn you up a bit. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Conor, who's going to speak tonight, as you can tell remotely. He was last here in September, or last spoke to us, I should say, in September 22, when he talked about idle days in Patagonia and home counties. And you can tell we like that talk because we invited him back. Always a good way. He's an author, a conservationist and a naturalist, written scripts for the BBC Natural History Unit and for many publications, lots of bird magazines and the national media, and a number of books. I've already mentioned Looking for the Goshawk, and one which, having looked it up today, I'm now going to put on my birthday wish list, which is, I can't say it. I knew I wouldn't be able to say that. Shrewd on it. If you don't know what it's about, have a look. It's lovely. And also, of course, Silence Being Revisited, which is tonight's topic, really. I'm sure many people will be familiar with Rachel Carson's momentous book, Silent Spring, which was published in 1962. And Conor tonight is going to tell us about the impact of that publication and what happened next. So I will pass you over to Conor. I'll turn the lights.
Take it away.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Sally, for the introduction and the invitation, and for organising tonight. So yeah, nice to be back with you, albeit on Zoom. Yes, so it's about what, 18 months since I came with the Hudson story, and then it's actually 8 years since I was there to talk about looking for the goshawk. So yeah, time moves on. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, the book that changed the world, and I'm going to tell you how the writing of this book came about. So I'll tell you a wee story, which brings in another quite famous nature book. And I was going to start on a cheerful note by saying that I don't know if you guys have had swallows in yet, but there was one here in West Norfolk, came back last Thursday, the 28th of March, so fairly early, to a site in a farm down the road from where I now live, which was lovely. This isn't it. Although what was nice was that it actually perched on a tree, which I know isn't unheard of, but certainly seemed very unusual to me. Anyway, the swallows are coming, so hang in there. So yeah, I'm just going to mention that partly to set a bit of context about who you're listening to, in case you don't know, and in case you missed these earlier talks. I mean, so I was there to tell you about this chap, and I'm pleased to say that the book is now out, now published. So I wasn't making it up. I did finally get there. It was a long time in the making, this one, and yeah, it basically tells the story of the folk who created the RSPB. Hudson is a sort of narrative device to tell the story of primarily the women who founded the RSPB. It's just easier to follow his trail because he wrote so much, and everyone kept his letters. So anyway, just by way of a bit of closure on that one. So yes, I've been there to tell you about looking for the goshawk, as Sally mentioned, and I don't know about you, but it seems to me that the goshawk is now getting out of the woods, and I'm certainly starting to see them much more regularly. I mean, I didn't used to see them at all, so the fact that I see them now is progress. So yeah, I mean, just in terms of my background, I mean, I spent most of my career, conservation career, at the headquarters of the RSPB at the Lodge at Sandy, this lovely Victorian building. And I left there about 5 years ago, and I now write the books full time. Sally mentioned Shrew Done It. I'll say a wee bit more about that. But yes, the Lodge, fond memories of there, and the wildlife. I mean, I was mostly office bound for my sins in my day job, but from time to time I could see things like this tree creeper, exploring the walls of the building outside. The RSPB's occupancy of the Lodge sort of coincides, you know, with the period of Silent Spring. I'm just showing this advert I found in Country Life at the time when the Lodge was for sale in the early 1960s, late 50s. And I guess the RSPB picked up on this. It was outgrowing its London headquarters, and so it needed a place in the country. And this caught its eye. It also caught the eye of Princess Margaret, apparently, although she ultimately pulled out of the bidding because there was a public right of way through the middle of the place, and there would be no question of that being closed. So anyway, so that was, I think, maybe to the RSPB's advantage, and the RSPB moved here 1961. So yeah, Silent Spring. It's a name that resonates with everyone, I think. It's one of those sort of very iconic, simple, powerful, almost unforgettable titles. It was very well chosen, and interestingly, I think Rachel Carson was intent initially on calling her book Man Against Nature, and actually it was her agent or publisher who said to her, well, actually, no, the title you've got for chapter 1 is much better, Silent Spring. And luckily, I mean, Rachel went with that judgment, and I think, you know, the rest is history. But yeah, there's a bit of a lesson there in choosing a title well. Anyway, I'll say more obviously about that. So yeah, apart from being desk bound for a quarter of a century, I did get out and do some volunteering, restoring the heath there, and etc., and trying to help critters like the natterjack toad, which has a sort of isolated but quite healthy population there. And then yeah, just to again put me in context of where I've been living. I mean, I was on fenland until quite recently for a decade, and this is helping on the project to try and reintroduce the corncrake to the Neen Washes RSPB reserve there, and yeah, put some of the sort of classic sounds of the countryside back into the countryside. This is very fortuitous and coincidental. Since I tuned in and we did our sound check and everything at 7 o'clock, I popped out for a bit of fresh air here, and I've just seen a little owl. There's some little owls that live not too far away from here in a pollard. It's sort of an old poplar, and anyway, here's one here. I did again just to make. But I mean, I for years was writing wee stories for the RSPB magazine, and again, often on bird song themes, and various, you know, adventures with birds in my back garden, including getting robins to nest in this old football. And that's what Shrewd on It is a compilation of those essays, if you like, many of them published in different magazines. So yeah, and Shrewd on It was the title of one of the stories. You know, I'll not give too much away, but it was a bit of a murder mystery. So something was chewing the heads of my neighbour's goldfish in our pond, and the water shrew turned out to be the prime suspect. Anyway, yes, so since I left RSPB, I worked for about 18 months at BirdLife International's collaboration in Cambridge with the university and a number of other organisations in the David Attenborough building. This was the occasion when the great man came and launched the place, saying that there's few things more important in the world today than what you're doing here. So no pressure. Anyway, you know the scale of the challenges that we face. So I'm going to touch on some of that this evening. I need to warn you. I mean, I'm not here to tell you I've got all the answers and I've worked out how we're going to save ourselves. But anyway, I hope what I'm going to tell you is thought-provoking, and what I'm most interested in really is the lessons of history and the importance of learning them, which isn't something I think as a species we're great at. So anyway, so what I'm going to, you know, take you on a wee trip down memory lane and maybe jog your memory on a few things, maybe tell you a few things you didn't know, and you know, we'll have a nice chat, I hope, at the end, and try and keep it upbeat if we can. I actually started my career at the Scottish Wildlife Trust for a time, so I kind of you know, done my time with the wildlife trusts as well, and yes, now I'm lucky enough to be able to live on the edge of the Wash, internationally important wetland and estuary here, with its wonderful mudflats and huge flocks of waders and wildfowl, and yeah, fabulous place that it is. I'm sure, again, most of you will have experienced it. Snettisham RSPB Reserve, for example, and places like that with its lovely birds, and its curlews, and its barn owls. So yes, just whetting your appetite for you know, indulging you in a few nice nature images before we get into the literature. So here's Rachel. Yeah, how this book came about, and it starts in maybe in a slightly unlikely place with this fella. This is a man called J.A. Baker, who I'm sure will be a familiar name to most of you, John Baker. Now he is and was the author. He looks a bit like Vic Reeves, if any of you you know, familiar with the comedian Vic Reeves, or maybe a little bit of Eric Morecambe in there as well. But anyway, here's a photograph that came to light not so long ago of old J.A. Baker. Here's another photo of him that came from his sort of private collection of him, I think out on the Essex coast. And so J.A. Baker, back at the time when Rachel Carson was getting involved in researching Silent Spring, he was writing a book and researching a book called The Peregrine, which is considered by a lot of people to be sort of, you know, almost like the classic, you know, nature writing, and a very, very sort of pivotal, important book. It was published in 1967, and made a bit of a stir. And again, I mean, a book I'm very fond of myself, and it's sort of, you know, there's always been a bit of controversy about this book, you know. So basically, people who know quite a lot about birds and to know quite a lot about peregrines, we're always a bit dubious about what J.A. Baker was describing and the kind of veracity of his observations. So either the accuracy of them, or whether, you know, he was using quite a lot of sort of poetic license. And a very interesting debate around how much this mattered. And so I kind of got caught up in that a bit, because everybody loves a peregrine, and of course they're absolutely like iconic species in the whole history, you know, the recent sort of history of the environment movement was one of the kind of iconic species that was hit really hard by the cumulative effects of sort of toxins, you know, agrochemicals accumulating in the environment. So yeah, part of the problem bird watchers, you know, ornithologists had with, you know, Baker's book was, you know, first of all, that Baker was having so many encounters with peregrines at a time when, you know, they were thought to be more or less, you know, gone, you know, wiped out by agrochemicals in our environment here. But also his descriptions often sounded like he was describing a kestrel, you know, seeing kestrels, because there's a lot of hovering going on, for example, and often he's describing the birds as sort of brownish and even yellowish, and, you know, so he was seeing something sort of, you know, unusual. The problem is that elsewhere in his text he describes these falcons, these larger falcons, chasing kestrels, and then, you know, he also describes them, you know, living in a hollow tree and pouncing on mammalian prey on the ground and doing all sorts of things that were not particularly, you know, associate with peregrines. So anyway, there's this sort of debates about what, you know, whether Baker was, you know, using quite a lot of imagination, or whether he was, you know, actually seeing things a bit or whatever. And this kind of reignited recently. Baker himself, I think, gives a clue to his modus operandi in the book itself, if you look for it. Anyway, this kind of reignited this debate more recently when he had passed away in the 70s. Anyway, you know, he suffered from ill health and passed away relatively young, and his wife Doreen, widow Doreen, she passed away in 2006, and when she did, she handed, shortly before she died, she handed over her late husband's notes and photos and diaries, etc., to David Cobham, and there was you know, an archive has been created at the University of Essex of this material, and there was a launch of that, etc., which is nice, with these bits and pieces, and these photos. And he was a bit of a frustrated poet as well, Baker. He was an office worker, and he did most of his explorations on bicycle through the winter months. So Doreen, his widow, handed this stuff over, and it kind of, you know, there was a republication of his book, and then a lot of, you know, with a preface by Mark Cocker and John Fanshawe, and And so anyway, the very interesting debate reignited, and so I became very curious also about the number of dead birds that Baker was finding in the environment, and he was attributing these dead birds to peregrine falcon predation. So that also made me very curious, because having sort of got very involved in sort of looking for goshawks in particular, but working with raptor experts generally, I mean, it became clear to me that there was something really not quite right about the sheer volume of dead birds that Baker had been finding. And that's when I sort of picked up Silent Spring and looked into that a bit more, and you know, discovered that there was an explanation in Silent Spring that I think most people had overlooked. So it seemed odd to me that we'd forgotten just how appallingly deadly the toxins and poisons were that we had unleashed on the environment at that time. They were so deadly. Unlike now, you know, they weren't just depriving birds of things to eat and places to nest, etc. They were killing the birds directly. You know, they were just directly lethal. The birds were falling over on their backs with their legs in the air. So anyway, so we're going back now to the early 1960s, and again, you know, some of you will remember the particularly brutal winter of 62, 63, which gridlocked Britain from December to March, and other, you know, pivotal things happening at that time, or, you know, the Beeching, you know, Dr. Beeching produced his now, I think, slightly infamous report on the state of the railways and made his recommendations that we shut down, I don't know, something like half of them, and which I think a lot of us nowadays have cause to regret, and was, again, I think, you know, very, I suppose, typical of the kind of lesson of history that we really should learn, you know, and the lack of foresight about actually the social and environmental benefits of this railway infrastructure that we created. But of course, you know, there was immense pressure from the roads lobby to go the other way. Anyway, so these were the sort of things that were happening at that time, among many others. And it was in this, so against this backdrop that Rachel Carson had been in America researching Silent Spring. Now, Silent Spring was published in America in the spring of 1962. The UK edition appeared, sorry, in the autumn of 62. The UK edition appeared in the following spring of 63, so it coincides with, you know, that the end of that very hard winter, etc. And in the preface to the UK edition is where I found this description by Lord Shackleton of just exactly what we'd experienced here in the UK. And interestingly, it's you know, there was particular incidents on the Lincolnshire coast, on an estate in Lincolnshire, and sat around Sandringham on the West Norfolk coast, where birds had been picked up in their hundreds and thousands dead, to everyone's great sort of, you know, astonishment. And this is sort of described in the preface to Silent Spring. So, you know, suddenly becomes obvious to me that this is the context in which Baker is exploring Essex, and is typical of what's happening everywhere. That you know, basically, you know, we'd unleashed products on our fields that were so deadly that things were dropping dead. And the things that ate those things were also dropping dead, including foxes, and there again hundreds, even thousands. And so, yeah, it's kind of apocalyptic. And again, you know, some of you may actually remember this or have read about it since. But it seemed to me that you know, I had to pull out. I didn't really quite grasp just how bad things had been. So anyway, there's a few quotes that I've lifted from that, those introductory pages. So anyway, so I got to work on writing Silent Spring, and tell the story of Baker and how it led me into, you know, this sort of quest to know more about the woman behind this extraordinary body of work. Who was she? What happened to her? Why don't we talk about her more often? You know, people I think recognize her name. And there's a thing, you know, if you were all here in person, I'd ask for a show of hands on, you know, so you'd all put your hands up and say, yeah, I've heard of Silent Spring. You might even claim to have a copy or have owned a copy in your time. But when you ask people who's read it, a lot of the hands go down. And that's fine, because what you also discover is that far from being a sort of poetic, lyrical piece of nature writing, I mean, it does have a bit of that. Silent Spring is really a very, very polemical, hard-hitting, fact-based, scientific, well, it's a polemic. It's got 55 pages of references. It's not a book you read on the beach on holiday. And that's interesting because, again, I think people think it is a kind of sort of lyrical book. And if anything, I mean, it's probably the least readable of 5 books that Rachel Carson produced. And I would always recommend to people some of the other ones that she wrote, which I'll tell you more about before this one. But this one very definitely made its point. So who was she? So Rachel Carson was born in 1907 in a small town called Springvale in Pennsylvania, in the hills of New England in North America. This is her house, and that's just to place it geographically, the state of Pennsylvania. This is her as a young lass, you know, with her beloved family pets and her brother and sister. And she grew up in this rather lovely sort of broader environment, but in quite an industrial little town. Her formative experience is one of her favourite birds is a bird they call the veery, which is a bit like our song thrush and has a beautiful haunting song. She always described her sort of formative, you know, that key moment in her young life that, you know, sort of set the path for the rest of her life, of how when she was with some grown-ups, you know, at top of the hills, looking at these rocks, it was pointed out to her that these were seashells in these rocks at the top of these mountains. And this blew her mind. You know, she was completely fazed by the idea that, you know, once upon a time this had been the seabed and now it was up here, and, you know, the sheer kind of drama and scale and sort of unimaginable time scales of you know, the natural processes of the earth really kind of blew her mind. And it was her first and really main love through life was the marine environment. That's what she was. She was a marine biologist by training and by instinct. And she, having been a very gifted writer from a very early age, very enthusiastic essayist, and intent on a, you know, some sort of career in writing literature, she discovered a real, you know, talent and interest in science at an early age, and was absolutely determined that that was the path that she was going to follow. And, you know, met the usual resistance that women would find at that time, which was, you know, there's no future for you in that. That's not for women. You know, there'll be no jobs for you. And she was really pioneering in terms of breaking that out of that sort of, or that kind of glass ceiling. And so she, you know, she trained as a scientist, and she went to, after graduating, she did a master's, and she was at a place called Woods Hole on the Massachusetts coast. And it was actually the first time she'd ever set eyes on the ocean when she went there to study. But now she was in her, you know, her element, almost literally, getting to grips with, you know, the wonders of the marine environment. She produced her first book in 1941, called Under the Sea Wind. It was the first of a trilogy of books about the oceans. This obviously came out, while World War II was in full swing, not long around the time of Pearl Harbor, in fact. And this book didn't do particularly well, and it always put her off, pursuing a career as a writer. But luckily, not quite. And this is the classic. This is the book I always recommend to people. And anybody who's got an interest in marine biology, this is a book they must read. It's wonderful. It really is. And actually, it was a massive bestseller as well. It is so wonderful of the oceans, and just the awe and kind of and just the wonder. It's the thing of knowing that we so much still to explain and discover about the seas. Anyway, she conveys all that really wonderfully, and it was another decade before this one came out. She had taken employment with the US government Fish and Wildlife Service, and she worked her way up and established some very strong links with people in government through that time. And then the third in the trilogy was The Edge of the Sea in 1955. And what these three books did was give her a degree of sort of financial independence that enabled her to give up her government employment and freed her up in a way to do her own thing. She wouldn't have been able to do Silent Spring while still employed. She did produce also a book for children called A Sense of Wonder, which again, she was an absolute sort of exponent and proponent of fostering in children their innate sense of wonder about nature and getting them out in the outdoors and sort of provoking their curiosity, etc. So themes that are very familiar to us increasingly today. Now, she never married and had children, but she did adopt her grandnephew, a boy called Roger. So she was, sort of full-time carer for him, and she'd been a carer for her mother as well, who died in 1960. She had a lot on her plate. And what happened in 1958 was, there was this sort of growing body of evidence that all was not quite right and well with these wonder products that were being sort of chucked out in the environment for various pest control purposes. Products that had been developed in wartime, actually, as chemical warfare agents. In 1958, her friend had got in touch with her to say that their 2-acre sort of homestead in New England had been sprayed from above by government planes and everything had died. And they called on Rachel, to do what she could with her contacts in government to get something done about it. Rachel, did, get in touch with her government contacts, etc. But it quickly became clear that, if anything was going to be done, she'd have to do it herself. And that's when the Silent Spring project sort of began. And it would take her 4 years of research and pulling together of the evidence and information to produce the book. So it was a long game. And she herself was really also suffering from ill health through this time. So I have a few images of what was going on. So the point generally is that, she was never saying don't ever, do pest control. She was always saying, don't do it this way, don't do this kind of indiscriminate sort of blanket sort of, spraying thing across the entire environment, when you're targeting one, two things, when actually you're going to kill everything. And she called these products biocides, they were lethal to all life. And yes, this sort of scene was commonplace, again, people absolutely oblivious to the risks and the dangers. and including, I think, in many cases, you know, the people doing the spraying, we just really didn't know it was conducting this sort of vast experiment on ourselves. And of course, you know, the most visible sign of a problem is, you know, when the birds drop dead and stop singing, and suddenly, you know, you've got a problem. So American robins, for example, you know, falling over dead. And again, you know, some of the best rehearsed, you know, examples are things like the bald eagles at the top of the food chain in North America, that, you know, the national bird of America, you know, the symbol of American sort of, you know, greatness, etc. And you know, they were wiped out. You know, this is a graph showing you the recovery. So, you know, again, you know, trying to put the positive spin on it, but you can see through the 60s what happened. They were virtually wiped out. You know, this is one example, but typical of the picture nationally. That you know, the things like DDT. DDT is the famous one, and the chemical that accumulated in animal tissue, and, you know, further up the food chain you went, the higher the concentrations, and then it would have impacts on the fertility of, you know, birds like the bald eagles, and they would simply be unable to breed. They might not die themselves, but DDT was relatively benign, if I did say that. You know, most of the others, agrochemicals, were, as I say, directly lethal. If you ate those or were exposed to those, then you were in trouble. And so scientists and conservation organizations were calling on the public to provide, you know, the data. There's an early sort of citizen science thing, as we call it now, where, you know, public were sending in the bird corpses that they found, and this started happening here in the UK at the same time. So the RSPB and others were, you know, receiving, you know, batches of dead birds, and then, you know, compiling the data which you need before you can get government to do anything. So yeah, so it was interesting times, and of course the media were, you know, either, you know, supportive through their cartoons, etc., or not. And of course there was a backlash. There was a backlash from the industry against you know, people like Rachel Carson, you know, saying, you know, that you know, she was sentimentalist and hysterical, etc. So, you know, she had to withstand really quite a lot of personal sort of attacks, and you know, undermining. She was extraordinarily stoic and brave. And President Kennedy, JFK, took a personal interest in this whole story, as you'd expect, even though he had a lot on his plate at that time, with civil rights unrest and various scandals going on, etc. Cuban Missile Crisis, all of these things were sort of, you know, going on in the world. And he called on his scientific advisors to form a committee to look into what Rachel Carson's book had set out. So basically, she simply presented evidence, and then a scientific committee was formed to assess it. So, so it was kind of, you know, considered at the highest level, and she was found to be right. You know, they agreed with her findings, and it was instrumental in affecting policy change. So that was, you know, so the book was vindicated. So, you know, anybody even today who's a sort of denier or a kind of dismissive of Rachel Carson, you know, you would simply tell. I mean, I do sometimes get that on, you know, social media. I get people saying, "No, terrible thing." Yeah, tell that to the government of the day and the scientific committee that you know, adjudicated on it. So anyway, so Kennedy was on board, and would be, you know, incidentally, you know, assassinated later that year, just to again set this in its historical context. And Rachel Carson was called before, you know, the cameras and the world's sort of press and media. And she was naturally a sort of reticent person, you know, quite shy person, not a, you know, big fan of public speaking, etc. So again, extraordinarily courageous, of all people, you know, to take this on, you know, it's Rachel Carson, and so here she is, you know, facing the cameras and the music, and yeah, as summarised very neatly in a programme broadcast nationally at that time, you know, that Rachel Carson's aims were met. You know, she wanted to alert the public, and then she wanted to light a fire under the government, and because ultimately she said, look, the public has a right to know, you know, what's being done, because they're picking up the tab. So and yeah, so the whole thing was success. So anyway, I've been asked to have a pause to let you have a comfort break, so I'm happy to stop there, and in the second part I'll talk about what happened next, and I'll try and summarise the sort of lasting impact and legacy of this wonderful woman and book over the next, well, 60 years. So
Thank you very much indeed.
back to Sally.
Hi, that was brilliant. Thank you for that. We're getting occasional messages that your bandwidth is low. I doubt if there's much you can do about it. We've got a few bits of breakup of sound, but nothing too bad. Right. But thank you very much. We'll now have a break for about 10 minutes and see you soon. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. Part two. So yes, Silent Spring made a bit of a splash, it's fair to say. It was a publishing phenomenon. It had sold 40,000 copies before it was even published. This was partly because it was serialized in the New Yorker in advance. And by Christmas, it was published in September, and by Christmas of that year, it had sold 100,000 copies. And it's never been out of print since. And so obviously the headlines then followed, and the sort of, you know, the great sort of the ructions in the media, and yeah, as I say, the ripples were soon felt here too, as conservation organisations like the RSPB and BTO and Game Conservancy and others sort of rallied to the cause. Now, the thing that, again, that I didn't know, and maybe you did, but when you ask what became of Rachel Carson, the underlying tragedy in all this is that throughout the time that Rachel Carson, over several years, was researching and writing Silent Spring, she was really quite seriously ill. And basically the underlying cause was cancer, and she had all sorts of associated illnesses. And so the stoicism, the bravery, the determination in the context of that is really quite phenomenal. And she didn't tell anyone. She didn't want anyone to know, even her closest friends, that she was ill. And she definitely didn't want the media to find out, and certainly not her opponents, because she knew that it would be used against her and against the cause. And in fact, Rachel Carson didn't live for very long after the publication of Silent Spring. I mean, really about a year after it was published in Britain. So really, it's quite an extraordinary story of sort of selflessness and sort of self-sacrifice and endurance in the face of, you know, really quite overwhelming odds. So in terms of what happened next, I mean, it's often seen as really a turning point, if not the launch pad of the environment movement, certainly in the Western world, Silent Spring. So it really is that kind of pivotal and iconic, and certainly sort of, you know, sparked the sort of the decade of the ecological movement. And in my book, I mean, obviously I can't begin to summarize the whole book in a short talk. But what I essentially set out to do was year by year to summarise the highlights the growth of the environment movement, mainly in Britain, and with a personal sort of family slant through it, only because that's the story I know best. But my family, I suppose, would just be typical of the sort of family that kind of, you know, got very heavily involved in all this from that time, particularly my mum. And so, you know, that's what I set out to do. I was very interested in, as well, in you know, as I love birdsong so much, I was very interested in how birdsong is very evocative of time and place in the way that music is generally. And so there's a bit of a sort of cultural sort of music theme running through the book as well, to again just to place environmentalism in the context of what else was happening at the time. And I mean, the iconic, possibly the most iconic moment here in Britain, in the, you know, and again, you know, something that absolutely sort of helped propel the movement forward, was the time in 1967 when the Torrey Canyon oil tanker went down off the southwest coast, and these images shocked, you know, the world really, because there was the solution to this problem of this awful oil slick was to basically to napalm it and set fire to it. So it was almost like going to almost literally going to war almost. But yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed you know, speaking to people about, you know, what they were doing through these times, what they remember, and yeah, it was, you know, the early 60s was obviously a time of sort of the great, you know, the white heat of technology, and we've never had it so good and all that. And I'll mention T.H. White and his wonderful book. You know, if you saw my Goshawk talk, or you've seen my book, you know, I talk about T.H. White's in you know, as a sort of subplot in that, and he happened to be in America over that sort of momentous winter of 63, 64, and kept this journal that captures really vividly, you know, the things that were happening, the civil rights movement, etc., and also the assassination of Kennedy. And the family part, you know, around the time I wrote the book, and my father passed away, and I was in the after, you know, for my mum, and we found from that time, and I had them sort of, you know, developed, and they were living in Africa at the time. My dad was teaching there, and although they were from Ireland, and so there's some pictures from Ireland there then too, and they always had, they were in a book club, and I remember they always had there was always a copy of Silent Spring on among this collection of books on the shelves at home. So it's kind of always been there as a thing. Anyway, so, you know, there's a bit of a, you know, a family thread running through it, and I found the photos of my father climbing Kilimanjaro at a time when it looked like this at the top. Essentially like glaciers, which of course are long gone with the warming climate. And then, you know, as I say, I can only really skim the surface of the main events, but you know, again, it's, you know, in the televisual age, you know, as we moved into the era of colour television, etc., the image of oiled birds, you know, has always been incredibly powerful in terms of, you know, capturing really, you know, the essence of what's going on. A sort of picture is worth 1,000 words. And those programs that we started to watch, you know, that got us all very excited about wildlife generally. And all the while, you know, all through this time, you know, Rachel Carson is a recurring feature. 1972, the USA finally withdrew DDT from use in America. I mean, it was still made and sold for use abroad, but you know, 10 years had passed, and that's probably, you know, sounds like a long time, but maybe in terms of getting environmental legislation through, it's possibly not quite so long. And again, through this time, my sort of love of, you know, wildlife was developing. Into the 80s, you know, we're starting to talk in terms of habitat loss and particularly deforestation. And Jimmy Carter, famously, the American president, had a photo of Rachel Carson on his office wall in his presidential suite. And of course, Al Gore became a sort of, you know, champion of the climate change cause. And 1990s, we coined the term biodiversity as we tried to, you know, take a more quantified approach to saving things. And again, you know, this is interesting. I mean, one marker of the growth of the environment movement is the growth of RSPB membership over this time. The graph starts at 1959, and you can see how around the time, you know, the RSPB moved to the lodge, it was, you know, organisation with about 10,000 members or so, and that doubled over a few years, and then, you know, just rose like the slopes of Kilimanjaro through these years of growing concern for what we were doing to our lovely planet. And then, of course, we're into the 2000s, the decade with the sort of no particular name, and of course we started to see the extreme weather events starting to happen more frequently with the warming climate. And again, just one highlight among dozens I could have selected, but, you know, RSPB sort of trying to, you know, show or lead by example by owning its own very ordinary arable farm, and to show how you know, it could work with birds without doing anything terribly fancy, that farmers could easily pick up and relate to. And then, you know, into the 2010s, and you know, again, just to mention that you know, we still conduct these experiments really in the environment with new products, and the burden is often on us to amass the evidence to show the harm against powerful industries with their own interests. And it's been interesting, you know, just again, one example is to watch the sort of the life history of glyphosate, or Roundup as it's neatly called, and how slowly but surely the verdict on this product has changed. Greta, bless her, you know, leading the way for young people, and into, you know, the decade we're now in. And what we now call rewilding, the restoration age. And so maybe that's how, you know, I would characterize, you know, where we're at now and what the future is. You know, it's really, you know, it's about I think we're into the era of repair. And you know, I think the hope and the optimism I think I would take, and certainly I hope others take, is that, you know, I don't think I think we've kind of won the awareness battle now, finally. I don't think anybody can really claim they don't know that there are problems that need to be addressed. Climate denial seems to be, you know, sort of fizzling out compared to certainly what it was like not so long ago. And yeah, I think we understand that our landscape, could look a lot different. I'm just going to show you now some images, again, you know, hopefully to sort of instill some hope. This was the summer before last. I think we had 40-degree temperatures, and that was really on one day at least. I had song thrushes nesting in my garden at the time, and I was keeping an eye on the nestlings, and this is them on that day. And I admit that I put down some extra water for them, and the parents, you know, were, I never saw them busier, actually. It was funny. You know, I think of this as our rain bird. You know, this is the bird that likes cool, damp conditions. And anyway, the happy part is that they survived and fledged quite happily. So yeah, nature, you know, it's tough. You know, it has its limits, but it's tough and adaptable and resilient. And yeah, you know. Again, I could have picked any of a multitude of headlines, but and I'll just tell you this wee story about how I loved finding in an old railway siding not far from home, which is now a vast sort of almost like landscape scale salvage yard, and I went there to sort of have a rootle around for odds and ends, and I found an absolute paradise for birds, I have to tell you, including the bird in the middle here. You know, if I had time, I would test you. But the bird in the middle there, perched on that, on those old girders and scaffolds, is a turtle dove, and it was purring away quite happily. And I loved that I checked with my car, my petrol head friends, and these cars coincide with the sort of the year of silent spring. And again, I'm not sure, I mean, why I found this so evocative. It's almost like it kind of shrinks time in a way that, you know, here are these cars that were produced then that are kind of still alive almost and still mouldering away in these in this old place where yeah, you know, the see what your mobile phone technology did, and yeah, bare-rooted post boxes. Anyway, you know, the world won, and I just love in the way how anyone lost a plane. This place was thronging with singing birds, and yeah, and the peacock is the most obvious of them. But there were swallows there and sparrows, you know, reptiles, and yeah, linnets and finches. So anyway, and I've kind of flown the flag for Rachel Carson where I can. I went to a conference. I was lucky and I got invited to a conference in New England where in America, they still revere her, and you know they have national Rachel Carson days, and she's still very, very much, you know, the patron saint of environmentalism there. And my other wee story from Cambridge from 2 or 3 years back, we did a climate demo. We walked through Cambridge. And at some point, the whole procession came to a kind of an abrupt halt. We wondered what had gone on, and what had happened was a peregrine falcon had made an appearance, and this had kind of brought the whole procession to a grinding halt. And because we were allowed access to the green spaces that are normally patrolled by men in bowler hats, I went for a look, and I found a peregrine feather, which I was delighted with, wee souvenir. And the peregrine falcons screech around in the kind of quadrant in King's College, and they're absolutely wonderful to see. And I mean, I traced my first copy of the peregrine I bought in Oxfam in Cambridge when I first moved down south, and I still had the receipts in the book, and I could see, you know, paid £1.25 for it in May 1993, so going back sort of 30 years. And I had no idea at that time that peregrines would reclaim our cities and our cathedrals across the land and Cambridge, and they nest on the front of the old pit building there and pose just above the passing traffic and Prem, and just allow you these wonderful views. Because it's April, and you know we've just had April Fool's Day, I made this nest to fool my colleagues at BirdLife, and I put some old drawer handles in it, took a photo and sent that round. I did fool a few people, even people who should know a lot better, but I won't tell you their names to protect their reputations. So yes, there's a pair of peregrines dining on the pigeon. up there on these wonderful spires. And there's a juvenile just after its maiden flight. So anyway, nature recovering and reclaiming our spaces. So yeah, Rachel Carson, worth remembering for sure. What an extraordinary life. Yeah, as I say, a familiar name here, but perhaps not much more. I took part in a French film company. I made a film about her a couple of years ago, and I helped a bit with that where I could. The mother of ecology, they called her. So yeah, iconic figure. Oh, and I did a Radio 4 broadcast on her too. And she, again, you know, any series on the key figures in the history of environmentalism has to include a place for Rachel Carson. So, you know, as she herself put it, you know, in the year that she died, yeah, there's something infinitely healing in the repeated frames of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter. What will sustain me in my final moments is an infinite curiosity as to what wonders will follow. And as she said, you know, why she undertook this epic project that was the last really, you know, thing that she did, was like, everything I loved was threatened. There would be no peace for me if I kept silent. So, you know, the themes I hope I've helped to kind of draw out are, you know, and that she, I think, wanted, you know, people to understand more widely was, you know, these things. But the one I would, you know, highlight is courage. You know, the courage of this woman was quite extraordinary. So that's Rachel Carson. She lived to be about the age I am now. So yeah, she died in her late 50s, and she herself put it, like the course of events provide the answer. You know, I think we knew at the time, and we know now that she was right, and that the things that she advocated were all eminently sensible. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be very, very happy to have, you know, hear your thoughts, and if there's any questions, I hope I can answer them, but it's a very broad topic. But you know, I'd be interested in any of your memories of that time, and the sort of the things that have happened since, and what you think for the future. So I'll hand back to Sally.
Thank you very much, Conor.
Thank you.
Conor, could I ask you to stop sharing your screen, and you can put your camera back on, and then we can see everybody on Zoom, including you.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just reset that so we can see everybody. There we go. Thank you very much indeed for that. I found that really interesting. I mean, I'd heard of the book. If you asked, said about having a show of hands, I'd have said yes, I've heard of the book, but I confess to never having read it. But I can see now how really important it was. So what do people, any questions from people in the audience here or on Zoom? We have one at the front here. You have, try shouting. If not, I'll have to repeat everything.
Is DDT still being produced for other countries?
Did you hear that, Conor, or do I need to repeat it?
I think the question is DDT still being produced and used in other countries?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it was always left to the discretion of individual governments, you know, to weigh up whether they wanted to carry on using it. I mean, that's a wide and complex discussion. You know, so you can make a judgment on whether you think the wider impacts and lasting negative effects of this enduring product are worth the benefit you might get from throwing it out at mosquitoes. But again, I think what generally you find over time is it becomes less and less effective. The mosquitoes develop immunity. You've impacted all those non-target things, including people, and there have to be better, more targeted ways of addressing the threat that you are trying to address. So there's a general point there that you can, my crude analogy is if you've got mice in your house, you can solve that problem by burning your house down. So you get the point. So anyway, that it's obviously been something that countries have grappled with and wrestled with, but over time, I guess you find that you're probably creating more problems than you're solving.
Thank you. Right. Any more questions here or on Zoom? If you've got a question if you're on Zoom and you've got a question, just if you unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Oh yes, Brian, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, hi Conor, what a very timely message, and it seems such a shame that we have to get to this state before the government and others will start to take notes, and then of course we've got all the years it's going to take them to decide what to do to carry it. So, but it was more an observation. I knew nothing about Rachel until I saw your talk was on. I just had a quick look on the website earlier about her, and I think it's such a strange coincidence. She wrote this amazing book that you've just talked about spring. I don't know if you know, she was actually born in Springdale in Pennsylvania and died in Silver Springs in Maryland. It's almost as if it was inevitable that she was going to pick this topic up and really rag something out of it. So I just I'd pass that on as an odd coincidence.
Yeah, nice to see you, Brian.
Yes, you too.
Hi. Yes, yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think I'd registered that myself at some point and forgotten. But yeah, I mentioned at the start, you may have missed it, that she was born in Springdale, and
you did. Sorry,
you might have missed the title. I mean, it's important because the title is so powerful, memorable. And it was actually, Rachel Carson was intending to call the book Man Against Nature, much, I think, less memorable and impactful title. And it was her agent who told her that she should use the title that she got on one of the chapters, which is what she opted for in the end. So it's it's a lesson in the power of simple, if you like, language, and creating a concept in people's heads that is really quite troubling. The idea that
I thought it was another coincidence too that she seemed to have picked up very much the thoughts of W.H. Hudson, who popped his clogs just before she came on the scene. And I've just finished reading your book on his topics as well. And he had a very active time having come over to the UK and pursuing these very messages. It probably took him longer to work out what was going on, but he saw, I think, even then, the very early stages of what you've just been talking about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and one thing I don't know is whether she was in any way influenced by him, but maybe I expect she must have known about his work because he was widely read in America, although had and yeah, I mean, so yes, she would have been 15 when he passed away. So yeah, she would have their lives overlapped a little bit. But yeah, well, good to know you've read the book.
nearly there. The last few pages to go.
Good, all right. Oh, brilliant.
Bless you. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Any more questions? Oh yes, we've got a hand up from Liz in the third row.
I call it. I have a. I've been.
If you come down here and have a chat, it means I don't have to try and repeat it, and you can talk to him properly. Because the microphone won't reach that far. If you're just standing around and
Is that there?
yeah,
Is that right?
fine. Yes.
Thank you, Conor. That was really interesting. I've read both Silent Spring and Silent Spring Revisited. I read Revisited first.
Oh,
Funny way to go about it. Just on, I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much. Silent Spring itself, I thought, and I dislike chemistry intensely as a subject, was really eloquent writing about chemicals as well as how they affected life. That was a big take for me from that book. But my question to you is, we still chuck chemicals on fields and bad stuff still happens. How, over your period, your lifetime being involved in this, how are you seeing our approach to managing chemicals change?
yeah. So I think we still, in principle, I think, do carry out. So obviously there's testing of products before they're licensed to be released into the environment or for use. But then what happens, I think, is that you don't really know till you use them in the real world on that scale what might be the side effects. And then the burden, as I say, seems to be on voluntary organizations to gather that evidence. So so that seems to me to be, well, fine if you've got the resourced voluntary organizations to do it, and minded to do it, but otherwise, So I mean, we do see it again and again. That so neonicotinoids is one example of something that is perceived to be benign enough to allow to be used in the field, and then you start to discover these sort of debilitating effects on pollinating insects that nobody wants to harm, because we all know, particularly people who grow things for a living, that's a disaster waiting to happen. So how you get around that is obviously it's a big question, but yeah, we're still doing it. And so I'm not going to give simplistic solutions, but it is just something that we have to be very, very careful about and on our guard about. I mean, I think the truth is, there's other things I could have shown and said, but you can look into them yourselves. But the industries generally, delay and delay for as long as they can when the evidence starts to mount against them. So we've seen various industries do this. I'll choose another example, which is the tobacco industry, which delayed and delayed and denied, and even brought on board scientists to, say that, that it was all scaremongering, etc. So this happens, and I don't think the pesticide industry can claim they don't or haven't done this too. So it's just something you have to keep on with. You have to fight the long fight, and keep the pressure on. But yeah, growing food. Growing food on an industrial scale is a challenge. It's a challenging thing to do. But yeah, I think we're in a better place now than we were then, but it's not perfect. So let's put it that way.
Thanks, Anna. Got another hand up from in here.
Government knows neonicotinoids do ban sugar beet farmers.
Do you want to come down? It'll take me. I'll find it very difficult to repeat all that. Like, come and say it down here rather than me try and repeat. Otherwise, Conor won't be able to hear you.
I don't know if I can see it there again.
Well, you can. You can. You just did it twice beautifully, better than I could. Go for it.
The government knows neonicotinoids will be. They ban neonicotinoids. The sugar beet farmers in East Anglia say there's going to be a problem up insect pests, and they authorise. What's you do about that? The farming lobby is stronger than the nature lobby.
I think we need to make more effort to complain to our MP. My MP is probably fed up with things like the same with things like thinner, which is now available over the counter to rub on my back and I've got backache. And then it gets washed down the drains and into the system where everybody has their water.
Yeah.
I wish I could be as optimistic as you are.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard that. Did you hear any of that, Conor? Somebody Ian in the audience was saying that we should be, thank you, that we should be protesting more and writing to our MPs rather than trying to do more about these things.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I would never discourage anyone from doing that. That's but
I
sure.
was actually going to ask you how optimistic you were, but Ian ended up the bit he's just said by saying that he's not as optimistic as you are. So rather taking that question, you do sound quite optimistic to me, though.
Yeah, in general, or on specific things, or
just in general. I think there's so many. There's too many things that you can get downhearted about. Specific issues, but overall, would you feel optimistic?
Yeah. Well, look, if I were to summarize, you know, my conclusion, if you like, you know, having sort of sifted through, you know, at that time 50 years of what happened next, I would say that as a movement, we've been tremendously successful at winning battles. We've won battle after battle, and we've, you know, but whether we're winning the war or not is another matter, because obviously there's the big stuff that's quite hard to win on a kind of battle by battle basis. But you know, I take heart from the fact that I mean, this is speaking for Britain. I mean, you know, obviously it's quite hard to speak for everywhere because we're all, you know, places are all facing different challenges. But you know, our species generally are hanging in there, and from that they can recover. You know, nature does have extraordinary powers of recovery if there's something left to recover, you know. So and I think, as I say, you know, awareness is only growing, and I think, you know, we'll save ourselves either because we have to, or just because we can, you know. So and that's, you know, that's the, you know, we've lived through what people, the fancy term is the Anthropocene, you know, the era, the sort of almost like the time scale, the relatively short one in which we reshaped the world, you know, and not always in a good way, but and now we're in the kind of restoration age. You know, I think that's where we're at. You know, we sort of sorting it out, which can be a lot of fun. So, but yeah, I think most people get that now. So yeah, let's try and stay upbeat. And
thank you. Okay. Any more questions? Oh, it's fine. Go on, Brian. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just thought I'd mention that for anybody who wanted to get involved in something, I've been looking at signing up myself. There's something called the Pesticide Action Network, or just Google PAN UK, and they're right in the midst of doing a whole lot of things, pressurising government, coming up with new technologies and whatever. So it might be worth people's interest if they want to look further into it or actually get active into it. Go on to PAN UK and see what it's all about.
yeah, that's a good shout, Brian. Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. That's quite an optimistic thing to finish on then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh no, another question, Bob. Are you going to be, is it short, or do you want to come down here and come on? Yeah, you're a long way away.
Conor's talking then of winning battles. And I'm just a bit cynical, really. Are we just winning the battles where nature is conferring a benefit for mankind? For instance, we want to protect forests because of carbon being taken from the atmosphere, because we're suffering from climate change at the moment. It's a realization that insects are important pollinators, so that they're all benefits for mankind. But is there any chance that nature can be protected simply because of the wonder it confers?
Yeah, no, well, for its own sake, yeah. I mean, you know, I think we can have both, really. I mean, I know there's a bit of a, you know, a bit of a schism sometimes between, you know, and people, you know, understandably, nature lovers object sometimes to people who can only see, you know, the point of saving nature for our own utility or benefit. But I think we can have both, and yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the conservation movement, of which you guys, I guess, are all part and are supporters, you know, has a long and proud track record of saving nature for its own sake, just for its intrinsic value and beauty. You know, ultimately we like this stuff because it's quite often it's just beautiful, and life enriching, but you know, deserves to live, you know, that deserves its place in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, let's, I mean, hopefully that's not too much of a politician answer, but it, you know, I think that let's just have both.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Any more questions from anywhere behind me on the screen? Or no, I think we've run out. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, Conor. It is sad that we've come to the end of our indoor meeting season, but wow, what one to go out on and to give us food for thought for the future, to say the least.
Well,
I share your, go on.
I hope I've stimulated, you know, your interest in Rachel Carson and her writing, and yeah, you'll follow up on that. And as I say, if you like a good read, and if you like the marine environment, then particularly her middle book of the trilogy is worth looking up. So
thank you very much for that recommendation, Conor. Thank you very much indeed for the talk. I'll just say thank you in the traditional way.
Oh, thank you. Like, great to see you all. Thank you very much.
Right, just a couple of quick announcements before we finish. Firstly, a big thank you to Sue for organising the indoor programme this season. We tend to take it for granted, I think. She does a lot of work to make this happen. So really, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in October 23rd at the next one. But in between, the birding season is good for you. So thank you all. And go on, by the way, if anybody wants to go for a drink, we might be going down the pub. So, you know, now is a good time. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Conor, we can't quite invite you for one, but you know.
Oh well, next time. All right, take care.
Okay.